On the 57th reset, Detective Mara Voss finally remembered the face that shouldn't have existed. Her own, 20 years older, smiling like a criminal. They called it time enforcement in polite press releases, chrono-policing in academic papers, and in the alleyways of Washington, D.C., the Time Loop Crime Agency, TLCA, in tones that mixed reverence with quiet fear. The agency sat behind a facade of federal funding and corporate sponsorship, a glass and steel annex on the Potomac whose atrium was planted with saplings older than most department chairs' careers. It was the United States' answer to the problem every modern state eventually faced. When the arrow of time could be bent, who would be allowed to pick up the bow? Mara Voss had been with the agency long enough to know the canned speeches. Time travel is regulated under the Temporal Statute of 2043, the brochures read. Only licensed temporal agents may conduct authorized corrections. But policy was different from practice, and practice was different from law. The Manhattan Project had taught the nation what secrecy did to public ethics. The TLCA taught them what secrecy did to memory. Mara's unit was Case Temporal, short CT7, an investigative team that specialized in chronocrimes that used short, localized loops. Thefts that unraveled a week earlier, assassinations that rewound into anonymity, frauds that erased ledgers and witnesses. Loops, in their most common form, were bounded time distortions. A day that repeated, a street corner that reset at midnight, a single event rewinding to its prior configuration. They were not the stuff of poetry, but of court transcripts, insurance claims, and divided line liability. Her job was to stitch continuity back together, collect evidence across resets, interview victims who remembered or didn't, reconstruct causality from the artifacts of choices made and unmade. She carried a standard issue, chronotape, a ribbon of encoded causality that marked divergent branches, a personal anchor, a device that prevented identity erasure during minor loops, and a battered notebook where she wrote things the machines could not, human impressions, moods, the texture of a confession. On the morning the case began, the TLCA alert chimed at 059. Unusual temporal persistence detected in 14th Street corridor, loop period 24 hours, anomalous subject signature, self-referential parity. Translation: a stable daily loop was centered on an urban stretch of 14th Street, and the loop's causal fingerprint matched a phenomenon the agency had cataloged only twice before: self-referential parity, where the loop referenced or duplicated the instigator within itself. Mara and her partner, Orrin Hale, arrived before coffee. Orrin was an ex-prosecutor with a grin that never seemed to reach his eyes, and a propensity for precisely organized chaos. He carried a law handbook in his messenger bag that had dog-eared pages at statutes Mara could recite in her sleep. He liked to joke that law was the only place where before was as consequential as after. They met the local field technicians beneath a flickering lamppost. The street was cordoned with quantum ribbon, thin filaments that shimmered where causality had been stitched and re-sewn. Vendors pushed carts. A woman with a stroller stood frozen mid-step, only to reset with each loop and never quite cross the street. Onlookers gathered, eyes like lenses. Mara watched them, cataloging the small anomalies. A dog that barked but never moved its tail. An old newsstand that sold the same newspaper each reset but with a single different headline. Victim profile? She asked. Orrin pulled up a tablet. 3 reported anomalies in the last 24 cycles. 2 assaults that unhappened. 1 apparent homicide erased entirely. Local emergency services show a 400% increase in phantom calls. Calls that are recorded by networks but whose callers are temporarily duplicated and vanish on reset. No firm human instigators yet. A thin man in a TLCA vest motioned them closer. "We've got witness consistency across loops, Detective. Every reset some people remember, some don't. There's a pattern to the memory. Older residents, people with long-term neural implants, tend to hold on to previous encodings. Younger folks, transient populations, less so. It's as if memory anchors favor continuity over novelty." That's normal, Mara said. Episodic memory is tied to hippocampal timestamping. Elder synapses, less plastic, hold on to previous encodings. But tell me about the signature. He handed her a printout, a spectral graph of causality. A peak in the graph repeated every 24 hours, but following that peak was a knot of harmonics, overlapping frequencies that suggested an intentional anchor, a person or an artifact, keeping the loop alive. Mara's stomach tightened. Self-referential parody was dangerous not because it produced paradoxes — the agency's containment protocols mitigate grand paradoxes — but because it allowed a causality to feed on itself. Someone who could loop themselves and create copies could in effect rewrite a local reality to their advantage indefinitely. Who would benefit from daily resets where events could be trialed, rehearsed, and perfected without consequence? She thought of con artists scripting perfect heists, politicians testing speeches in a closed micro-universe before delivering them live, lovers rewriting their confessions until satisfactory. All fantasies, perhaps, but greed and power had reliable imaginations. Their first subject interview was with Eliza Trent, a 70-year-old jazz singer whose apartment overlooked the stretch. She reported remembering fragments of events, as if reading a book with pages torn out. A scream that always came at 7:12 p.m., a black car that arrived and was gone, a young man who would stand at the corner and stare at the sky until the reset. She told them, "I bake bread and leave it on the sill. Every morning it's fresh, or maybe it was yesterday. Sometimes my cat recognizes me, sometimes he looks at me like I'm a stranger." Eliza's account had the exact hallmarks Mara had seen before: temporal dissonance, episodic continuity for some sensory loops, and a refusal of simple chronology. When Mara asked whether anyone had agency, someone actively repeating events, Eliza looked at her as if the answer was obvious and said, "A face, in the glass, not mine." She had described a mirror in a cafe, a reflection that lingered a millimeter different from the subject movement, a reflection that smiled half a second too soon. Self-referential, Oren murmured. Someone using a personal anchor to maintain a loop that includes them as a persistent element. The trick is to find whether the loop is preserved by hardware, a device, or by a person with an anchor. Devices leave traces. Hardware, especially illegal temporal devices, often carry unique quantum signatures in the local causality field. The agency's sensors could read them, amplify them, and map them. They swept the block with handheld chronoscanners that hummed like wasps. The scanners flagged a basement behind an old printing shop. The map showed a dense causality locus. Within its weave lay a pattern they recognized from an archival file labeled Echelon Loom, 2058, Criminal Fabrication of Private Loops. The printing shop belonged to a small press, Patriot and Print, a publisher of local history and pamphlets. Inside they met Jonah Mercer, a wiry 35-year-old with ink-smudged fingers and eyes that betrayed both intelligence and an aversion to answers. His press smelled of solvent and paper glue. It hummed with the noise of a machine that hadn't expected guests. "Don't shoot," Jonah said, at first, hands open. "I'm not who you think I am." Mara studied him. She had the agent's gaze, how a man sits when he hides something, the pull of a left thumb in his pocket, the habit of answering questions with counter-questions. "What do you publish here?" Jonah's laugh was sharp. Truth, mostly. Local histories. Stories the big houses don't want printed. "I also fix old clocks." "Clocks?" He tapped his temple. "Temporal hardware. Old mechanical anchors are quaint, but I've been tinkering with chronosystems on the cheap. You know that rural markets love memorabilia." He watched Oren. You can't prosecute someone for selling a novelty that rewinds a broken watch. Mara had a file on Jonah when she left. Minor infractions, a past as a maker in the DIY chrono hacker scene, fines for unauthorized temporal experiments. Suspicion, however, was not proof. The agency's legal dance required evidence strong enough to survive a temporal defense. A defense the agency itself had to craft to counter manipulators who could scrub their alibis across resets. That night, Mara sat at her desk and read through the forensics. The TLCA had cataloged 1 million loops and the oddities within them: heirloom echoes, anchor nests, branching redundancies. The ticket for this case was complicated by 3 things. First, the loop's persistence meant someone or something had been deliberately maintaining it. Second, there were temporal duplicates, not mere echoes, but full-bodied instantiations that carried memories across resets, to varying degrees. And third, and most troubling, an emergent pattern in the duplicates that suggested communication between them. Communication? If loop instantiations were conversing across resets, the implication was crushing. A single day could become a band of coordinated agents, each iteration learning and changing strategies. A con could be rehearsed in an hour and executed perfected on the 50th trial with identical conditions. The agency's ability to protect causality depended on the assumption that repeats could not be coordinated outside of hardware. Here, coordination had breached its cord. They found the first evidence in a cafe camera. A grainy clip showed a young man. Mara recognized him as the corner-staring figure, pause, glance at his wrist, and smile. At 19:12, as the scream echoed, he lifted a small device to his mouth and whispered something. The thing was a whisperer, a miniature comms module, illegal for temporal use, but touted in underground markets. Whisperers were designed to stitch short memory transfers between instantiations, a bit of data passing from one reset to the next through a tiny entanglement that survived loop closure. Once you let information through, you let strategy leak, Mara told Oren. This becomes a different class of crime. Corporate espionage, rehearsed assassination, consensus scam. You could fake market movements by executing small, repeated trades inside a closed loop to see which algorithm misfires. You could run political messaging in microwaves to test emotional reaction before release. The world becomes a rehearsal space for the powerful. They visited the market of minor goods at dawn, where secondhand chronoware changed hands. Traders wore masks to protect their private anchor keys. Jonah's name showed up on a ledger, a sale 2 nights before to a buyer listed as M44. The ledger, paper, ink, had the odd property of retaining ink from multiple resets, like a palimpsest of commerce. The buyer's signature was a stylized M that resembled a crown. The trail evaporated at a coffee shop, where a woman named Lila worked, a barista whose parents had migrated from Queens and who remembered, for reasons unknown, the faces of people who never quite existed. They tracked the signature to a shell company, Midas 44, registered under an offshore grace period that looped new owners into existence to dissolve paper trails. Midas's board included a retired senator, a venture capitalist with a liking for biobanking, and, oddly, a nonprofit for veterans' temporal therapy. The latter raised Mara's suspicion. Therapy was the public justification for temporal access, a civic salve that could be misused to wash guilt. When they subpoenaed records, Midas supplied a tidy set of documents: grants to neurochronologists, donations to veteran support, and a research partnership with a lab called Janus Dynamics. Janus, Mara knew, had been at the center of ethical hearings 5 years earlier for creating soft loops as neurorehabilitative devices. The agency had let them keep operating under strict oversight. Janus's CEO, Dr. Evelyn Shaw, had presented herself as a steward of memory. They found Dr. Shaw at a charity gala, an elegant woman who spoke of memory as sacrosanct. Her smile was practiced. She said, "We're in the business of healing. We help veterans whose temporal perception has been fractured by combat. We restore continuity." "Do you have partnerships with Midas 44? Mara asked. Her brow tightened for the briefest moment. "We consult with many organizations on ethical deployment, but if you suspect wrongdoing, detective, we cooperate with any investigation." Cooperation in TLCA parlance often meant preemptive compliance calibrated to prevent legal escalation. Dr. Shaw provided logs, a year's worth of experiments, anonymized. The logs were dense: patient IDs, protocol numbers, entanglement metrics. Beneath the clinical jargon, Mara noticed an irregularity, a recurring code attachment to a subset of sessions, tagged Project Rehearsal. Project Rehearsal's notes were evasive, references to microtrials and behavioral conditioning, but also to free market deployment. It smelled like a prototype that had graduated into profit. It was this smell that eventually revealed the human shadow at the heart of the loop, not the pyrotechnic chaos of a rogue chrono hacker, but a carefully executed corporate program with legal cover, political connections, and a vision of America as a laboratory. Their motive was banal and dangerous in equal measure: to reduce risk by letting the wealthy test outcomes in closed time, then release the successful version into the open world. Imagine a campaign manager who could test 7 different speeches across 7 morning resets, seeing which speech increases donations. Imagine a CEO who could try 50 product launches in a week and pick the one with minimal backlash. Imagine being able to rehearse an assassination until the guard's pattern is memorized. Mara's mind went darker to more intimate uses: an old lover rehearsing a confession, a parent rehearsing a lie until it sounded true enough. The loop's power to optimize human behavior was the pandemic agency had hoped to prevent. But motives required leverage. Who among Midas's patrons would find value in a loop centered on 14th Street and its past of residents? It could be anything: a testbed for a compromise, a social experiment, an influential donor's vanity project. The clues suggested that Midas's clients weren't just political or corporate actors, they were curated. Their tastes skewed toward power, wealth, and the comfort of controlled risk. The breakthrough came not from a boardroom, but from a janitor's cart in the basement of Janus Dynamics. A maintenance worker named Pedro, loyal to his rent and fond of crossword puzzles, had noticed a pattern in the lab's trash: shredded anchor keys and a set of barcode stickers that matched a batch used in rehabilitative units passed to veterans. He had pocketed one sticker. It bore a stamp M44. Pedro's testimony was quietly damning. They were burning bindings, but sometimes they threw the electronics in a locked bin labeled procedure artifacts. I couldn't access it. I'm just a man with a broom. The bin's contents, when retrieved with a warrant, held whisperers, anchor fragments, and a prototype labeled Rehearsal V1.1. The device's schematic suggested a hybrid, a therapy tool repurposed to create a private loop with a whisperer bridge. It had been field tested, not in battlefields, but in the city, a human-scale stage. They arrested Jonah Mercer that week, not because he was the mastermind, but because his low-end tinkering made him an ideal middleman. Under interrogation, he confessed in fits and starts. He had sold devices to Midas, hacked together whisperers on demand, and been present for a test of the loop, a simulation run to see whether market behavior could be manipulated by repeated micro-social nudges. He claimed he had thought it a niche project and that he was appalled when he realized the loop's effects. But by then, his involvement had been baked into the pattern. The loop was not a single device, but a socio-technical web. Yet arrests were temporary solutions when causality itself could be patched. To break a loop, you had to either remove the anchor or find a point of divergence whose removal created a stable alternative future. Policy was clear: minimal interference. The agency's mantra, preserve as much as possible, correct only what is necessary, was not a moral phrase, but an operational constraint. Every correction carried ripples. Undo too much, and history shivered. Mara's task was to find the pivot, the moment within the 14th Street day where, if changed, the loop would collapse or no longer be useful as a rehearsal. They combed through hundreds of resets, each iteration a grain in their microscope. They found patterns: a particular scream at 1912, an arrival of a black car at 1737, a duded handshake at 2004. The loop's kernel was a small event, an exchange of a memory shard between 2 instantiations of the same person. That exchange allowed the copies to coordinate their learning. The moral calculus was staggering. If she prevented the exchange, she would stop the loop.
but she would also erase the memories instantiations had used to develop an empathy that had grown, window by window, within the loop. She had to balance the rights of looped instantiations, marginal, ephemeral beings with fragments of personhood, against the rights of the larger population whose lives were being used as rehearsal rooms. Late one night, Mara sat with Jonah in an interrogation room. He was thin and tired. He said, "You think this is just data, but someone was trying to fix a mistake." "What mistake?" she asked. He shrugged. "You ever rehearse a speech? You do it in front of the mirror. The mirror learns you. The mirror gives back a version of yourself that's perfected. People with money want a mirror for the world. And you made the mirrors." Jonah's eyes flashed. "I made them cheap. Midas added the polish. They ran tests on 14th Street because it had the right mix of churn and anchor. Transients who could be disposable. Residents who remembered. You know how they bought my whisperers? They told me it was for veterans. They said it was for therapy. I thought I was helping people rehearse themselves out of nightmares." Mara wanted to believe him. She was also an investigator trained to expect the opposite. Their legal team filed a seizure warrant for Janus Dynamics rehearsal servers. What they found was worse than a business model. It was an ideological map. Project Rehearsal's design document read like a political
Pamphlet. It argued for iterative governance, the idea that society, like software, could be A/B tested in closed environments to find the optimal regulation. It spoke of reducing the entropy of decision-making. It placed ethical justifications in the margin and profit in the header. The public reaction was the thunderstorm you expect after a quiet summer. The headlines thundered across outlets. Time loops for sale? Are our lives rehearsed? Veterans used as beta subjects? The public hearings spiraled. Midas's board retreated behind legal counsel. Dr. Shaw testified to benevolent intent. For a moment, the nation considered whether their democracy had been gambled with by a small group who assumed a right to experiment on reality. But the loop did not care for headlines. It continued until the day Mara made a decision. She identified the pivot. An exchange on the bench outside Eliza Trent's apartment. An old man gave a young man a small bite of data embedded in a coin. The coin, when passed, served as a memory bridge. It had been curated by Jonah, sold to Midas, and used in the rehearsals because it was tactile and unsuspecting. A tiny physical object that survived resets where digital signatures failed. To stop the loop, Mara could intercept the coin. But to intercept the coin was to interfere with a moment that, for one instantiation, represented a triumph. A man who had used the loop to rehearse penance, who had regained an old memory and wept in a way Mara had seen only twice in her career. To seize the coin was to deprive someone of a human closure they could only find inside the loop. She weighed the options with the bureaucracy at her back and the law at her shoulder. There was an interim fix: collapse the Whisperer bridge while preserving the coin's transfer. That would end cross-iteration communication without erasing the personal moment. The agency's technical team could dream up such a surgical correction. A microfilter that terminated entangled whispers but let single-instance tactile transfers pass. It would be messy, risky, and technically vicious, and it would avoid extinguishing the instantiation's sorrow. They scheduled the operation for midnight. The street thrummed with the low hum of containment vans and policymaker observers. Mara's hands were steady as she fingered the chronotape for the 10th time. She had been trained to hold discomfort in a leather pocket and to perform the necessary acts regardless of how much the heart wanted otherwise. At 23:59, she positioned herself near Eliza's bench. The old man arrived, breath clouding the air. He was not a villain in any deep way. He was an old husband who had failed to say goodbye properly and who had found in the loop the chance to try again. He sat and handed the young man a coin, a memory shard. They spoke for a little while. The young man smiled, and Mara saw the kind of small reciprocation she had read of in diaries. a reconnection that sealed a wound. She signaled the tech team. The filter activated, whisperer entanglements collapsed with a sound like a tissue tearing across a drum. The loop's cross-communication extinguished, and for a few breathless seconds, time felt unstitched. Then, subtly, the daily pattern failed to reassert itself. At midnight, the scream came. At 001, the black car pulled into the alley and simply drove on. The day moved forward as it should. The coin had made its exchange, and the old man had got his closure, an outcome Mara had loved and feared equally. Yet, endings are rarely clean. Rehearsal's infrastructure remained. Midas's money had bought patents and political cover. Janus Dynamics had been discredited in public, but their networks remained, and their scientific knowledge could not be unlearned. Jonah was charged and offered a plea deal. In exchange for cooperation, he would testify against Midas and Janus. Dr. Shaw resigned and accepted a position as a consultant to an international ethics group. A whisper of responsibility served to soothe a public. But beneath the headlines, a subtler thing happened. The loop's instantiations, those ephemeral selves who had been born within loops, did not simply evaporate when the loops closed. The agency recorded that a handful of individuals who had developed deeper continuity retained fragments in their long-term memory. Their lives, marked, had been altered by a day that no longer repeated. They were survivors of a rehearsal that had shaped them. The law had to decide how to consider their claims. Were they victims, witnesses, participants, or a new class of personhood? The TCLCA convened a panel to recommend policy. The panel's report, dense and cautious, recommended limits on private loops, strict licensing, and community oversight. It urged transparency and warned of the perils of letting rehearsal economies concentrate in private hands. In a democracy, the report argued, experimentation must include informed consent, not just from the test subjects, but from the culture at large. Mara gave testimony to the committee. She spoke not like an agent of a bureaucracy, but like someone who had watched time behave like a petulant child, unpredictable, fragile, capable of beauty and cruelty. She read into the public record the words she had scribbled in her notebook. A rehearsal for life cheapens the thing rehearsed. There are wounds that cannot be closed by repetition. There are apologies that must be given in the public light, not in a private loop. The months that followed were slow and full of legislative language. Congress argued about definitions, what constituted temporal entanglement, what qualified as therapeutic use, and the jurisdictional lines between federal enforcement and state oversight. The press ran features on veterans who claimed rehearsal had helped them. Op-eds countered that the veterans had been exploited. The nation had a conversation that left some soot on its lips. For Mara, the case had seeded something darker in her chest. The self-referential parody that had animated the 14th Street Loop was not an isolated trick. It was the prototype of a new industry. She had seen the documents, the patents, the memos that spoke of categories and cohorts, and the moral calculus that had been performed in rooms where power tasted like metal. She had also seen the human closure that the loop had enabled, and she could not fully condemn the people who had come seeking it. One autumn evening, nearly a year later, Mara received a package with no return address. Inside was a single coin, worn at its edges and stamped with a tiny M44 sigil. There was no note. She turned it in her hand and found her reflection in its polished face. Her face, in a corner of it, 20 years older, smiling like a criminal. The observation made her fingers cold. The agency flagged it immediately. Whoever had sent the coin wanted her to remember, or to be uncertain. They had known where to place their call. Mara kept the coin in a drawer. She read the transcripts of witnesses, the testimony of Jonah, the white papers of Project Rehearsal. She filed complaints, opened oversight files, and watched the bureaucratic machinery do what it does best, incrementally reshape policy. But the coin remained an artifact,
A reminder that whatever framework the law built, someone would always seek a way to rehearse advantage. On a quiet night, Mara met Owen for drinks near the river. The city glittered like an apparatus. Owen seemed less certain than usual, the lines at his eyes deeper. "You okay?" Mara asked. He sighed. "You know the worst part. We did what we could. We stopped the loop, we charged the middleman, and Midas took a public beating. But it feels like a containment exercise, like catching a fly with a web. The bug is caught, the web remains." Mara thought about the coin and of the mirror that learns you. "The web remains," she said, "but nets can be made more visible." "And policy?" Owen asked. "You really think policy will stop people?" "No," she said, "but people will remember the cost." She thought about Eliza's bench, the old man handing over closure, the young man whose life had been improved in some small way despite being exploited. She thought about the veterans who had found peace. She thought about Jonah's thin hands and his regret. The TCLCA's life would be a cycle: clean up, legislate, watch, adapt. The nation would argue about agency powers and ethics and the right to replay grief. Mara would age into the times she policed, her notebook filling with the residue of cases where human longing collided with technology. She had, for years, been in the business of restoring forwards. The day she retired, if she ever retired, she suspects she would keep the coin, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the slippery boundary between experiment and life. Time, she had learned, does not like to be tricked. It will often repay the trickster by making them forget their motives. On the 57th reset, meaningless now, a historical phrase, she remembered the face she had seen in the polished coin. It had not been a trick of optics. It had been a warning that anyone who learned to rehearse the future could, without meaning to, trade humanity for efficiency. She placed the coin back into the drawer and closed it. Outside, the city moved forward in its messy, non-repeatable way. Children played in parks whose swings squeaked in unique harmonies. Politicians misstepped publicly. Lovers argued and reconciled with a fragility that could not be optimized. Mara walked home through those streets with the kind of quiet gratitude that only someone who had seen the alternative could feel. There would be other loops. There would be other Midas companies, other Janus labs, other Jonah Mercers selling cheap mirrors to those who could not resist their own faces. But there would also be the law, the TLCA, and the slow insistence, sometimes messy, sometimes bureaucratic, that a democracy belonged to the people in a way that could not be white-labeled into a rehearsal. When she slept that night, her dreams were ordinary. Rain on a tin roof, a cat purring, the smell of coffee. In the morning, she woke up not because the day had reset, but because the world had continued. That, she decided, was the miracle she would defend. The lights on the ceiling flickered as Ethan stepped into the corridor. This wasn't the polished, high-tech hallway he remembered from his recruitment days. The agency lab felt drained, quiet. Too quiet for a building that practically hummed with timeline activity. A nervous technician hurried past him, almost colliding. "Ethan, the director wants you in ops. Now." Ops? At 6:13 a.m.? That room only opened when the agency had a chronological emergency, something big enough to alter American history or humanity's survival. Ethan quickened his pace. Inside ops, giant time calibration rings circled above holographic tables. Multi-spectrum screens showed cascading strings of dates glitching, repeating, folding over themselves like corrupted film reels. Director Helena Price stood at the center of the chaos, steel-eyed, sharp voice, the kind of leader who could stare down a paradox and make it apologize. "You're late," she said. "I wasn't scheduled." No one was scheduled, because this day wasn't supposed to exist. Ethan froze. "Ma'am? What?" She pulled up a hologram. A looping timestamp glowed. January 17th, 2049, 6 a.m. January 17th, 2049, 6 a.m. January 17th, 2049. Over and over. Locked. We're inside a time loop, Helena said. Not a natural one, a manufactured one. Ethan's stomach twisted. Someone had created an artificial loop, powerful enough to trap the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. Millions of people would wake up again and again in the same hour with no memory of the repeats. Except the agents. Their badges protected them. Who did this? Ethan asked. Helena turned to him slowly. That's why you're here.
A surveillance feed expanded in front of him. Washington, D.C., 5:59 a.m. A cloaked figure stood on the rooftop of the Federal Time Research Vault. In their hand, a shimmering device emitting ripples of blue energy, the kind only seen in illegal chronotech. The figure lifted their head. The camera caught a clean image. Ethan's breath vanished, because the face staring back at him was Ethan Carter. His own face, older, hardened, a thin scar across the left cheek, a scar Ethan didn't have. He stepped back, pulse racing. That's impossible, he whispered. That's not me. Not yet, Helena replied. The room fell silent. He broke into the time vault at 5:58 a.m., triggered a stabilization burst at 6 a.m., and now the entire morning is replaying on a closed loop. The city, the federal district, and potentially the whole country if it expands. Ethan shook his head. I would never. We don't know what you will or won't become, Helena cut in. But we do know this. The attacker predicted your every move. He expected you to be assigned to the case. So this is personal, Ethan said. No, Helena corrected. This is temporal. She slid a small briefcase toward him. Inside lay a compact temporal field disruptor, black, humming with fractal patterns only agents were authorized to touch. You're going back to 5:55 a.m. today, before the loop triggers. To stop him. Ethan swallowed. What's my mission protocol? Helena tapped her badge. Protocol 0. He froze. Protocol 0 was only authorized for one situation. If the timeline's biggest threat is an alternate version of yourself. Helena leaned in close. Agent Carter, listen to me carefully. Whatever version of you created this loop, he knows our technology, our rules, our weaknesses. He will anticipate the agency. He will anticipate you. Why? Ethan asked. Why would I trap the entire city in a loop? Helena's voice dropped. We don't know. But he left a message. What kind of message? Helena turned on the final recording. A distorted, older version of Ethan stared into the camera. Don't break the loop. If you do, the world ends today. Ethan stood frozen as the echo of his older self's warning faded from the speakers. The room felt colder now, as if the message itself had sucked the warmth from the air. Don't break the loop. If you do, the world ends today. Helena folded her arms. We have never, ever received a threat like this. Ethan forced a breath, steadying himself. So what's our response? Helena's jaw tightened. You break the loop. Ethan blinked. But I know what you heard, but we do not negotiate with rogue variants. Your older counterpart has committed a Class Red temporal crime. He engineered a loop that, if strengthened, could fracture the Eastern timeline entirely. Every repeat destabilizes the national chronoscape. Once it reaches maximum resonance, she pointed at a simulation. A map of the United States flickered, glitching, splitting into overlapping ghost images. New York appeared twice, Chicago 4 times. The West Coast simply disappeared. The entire country collapses into divergent shards. Helena stepped closer. We don't know when it reaches critical mass. Could be minutes, could be hours. We won't survive a full day.
Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted answers desperately, but right now they didn't matter. "Send me," he said. "I'll stop him." Helena nodded. "Good. Prep for insertion." A tech ran up with a temporal harness, sleek, black, studded with micro-reactors. "Agent Carter, your temporal anchor is calibrated to 5:55 a.m. Eastern Time. You'll have exactly 5 minutes before the loop resets again." "Plenty of time," Ethan replied, but he didn't feel confident. This was his first variant pursuit, and the variant was himself. The tech swallowed. "One more thing." He held out a chip. "This appeared in your locker this cycle." "My locker? This cycle?" Ethan frowned. "How? No one can access agency lockers." "That's the thing," the tech whispered. "The system logs show your biometric signature." Ethan felt a deep, cold knot twist in his stomach as he took the chip. It was smooth, thin, with one etched word: remember. Before he could ask questions, Helena called out, "Agent Carter, to the platform." Ethan pocketed the chip and stepped onto the shimmering temporal launch pad. The air around him vibrated with harmonic energy as a dome formed overhead. Helena gave the final command: "Mission 0 initiative authorized. Target, Variant Carter. Location, Federal Time Research Vault rooftop. Time, 5:55 a.m. Objective, apprehend or eliminate. Prevent activation of loop device." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Engage, jump," Helena said. The world stretched, folded, snapped, and Ethan was gone.
Ethan materialized on the cold rooftop 5 minutes before the loop's ignition. Washington, D.C. looked surreal at dawn. Pink horizon, quiet streets, a city unaware that it was caught inside repeating eternity. He scanned the area: flat concrete, vent systems, a single maintenance door, and then a voice behind him. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Ethan spun. His older self stood only 10 feet away. Same face, same eyes. Except older Ethan's eyes carried something else: sadness, exhaustion, and a quiet knowledge that chilled Ethan to his bones. "You're early," Variant Ethan said. "Good. We don't have much time left in this cycle." Ethan raised his weapon. "Step away from the device." Variant Ethan smiled faintly. "I can't. You know that." The device in his hand pulsed with blue energy, humming like a heartbeat. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan demanded. "You're trapping millions of people in a loop." Variant Ethan shook his head. "You don't understand. I'm saving them. By forcing a time loop? By preventing the next hour from happening." Ethan frowned. "What happens at 7 a.m.? Variant Ethan paused. He lowered the device slightly. "Everything ends." Ethan stared. "What does that mean?" Variant Ethan stepped closer. "Tell me, did you find the chip in your locker?" Ethan stiffened. "How did you—" "Because I put it there," Variant Ethan said softly. "I'm trying to break just one rule of the agency: no communication between variants." "Why?" Ethan whispered. Variant Ethan looked him in the eyes, his own eyes. "Because I need you to remember what happens next." He reached into his coat. "Here, before the loop resets." He handed Ethan a second chip. "Insert this when you return. When you do, you'll understand everything." Ethan hesitated. "I can't accept anything from a rogue variant." Variant Ethan's face tightened with frustration. "You have to. If you don't, millions die in exactly 47 minutes. Ethan felt a chill slide down his spine. Variant Ethan raised the device again. "I'm sorry. This next part will hurt." Before Ethan could react, the world flashed white. The loop reset. The white flash collapsed around him like a shutter, and Ethan's stomach lurched. For a second, he felt weightless, as if the world had forgotten him, and then gravity reasserted itself with the rustle of rooftop grit under his boots. He was back at 5:55 a.m. again. The city's horizon was the same color, The cold bit at his jaw. Variant Ethan stood where he had, device humming like a small star. This time, Ethan did not reach for his weapon. He did what Variant Ethan had asked. He took the second chip with fingers that trembled and tucked it into the inner seam of his harness. The metal of the harness accepted it with a soft click. A series of nanofibers glowed, reading the chip's encrypted signature. "What did you do?" Ethan asked, voice low. Variant Ethan watched him with one of those tragic, tired smiles that only comes from carrying knowledge too heavy for one person. "I prepared for contingency. If you kill me now, the loop continues forever, and the cascade grows. If you stop me without understanding, you might unwind a failsafe that holds a different disaster at bay. You have to see what I see." Ethan's training battled with a strange rising empathy. Protocol said variants were threats, contagions of causality that could not be permitted autonomy. But this was his face asking him to trust him. "You said the world ends." Variant Ethan didn't speak. He stepped back to the device and laid his palm against a glassy touchpad. A hollow map unfolded above the rooftop, lines of causality as easily readable as a street map. A knot glowed at the vault's core, a temporal construct, a stabilizer, meant to regulate micro-resonances from the lab's experiments. The stabilizer had a scheduled self-termination at 7 a.m., a legal safety mechanism never intended to be tripped in the field. But someone in a remote command node, had scheduled an unauthorized reboot today, an automatic purge that would scrub temporal logs and, due to a latent entanglement bug, amplify residual microloops into a macro resonance. If it reboots with entanglement unchecked, the stabilizing matrix resonates and amplifies. It will cascade, a chain reaction of loops folding so fast the agency's anchors can't hold. The eastern seaboard will snap into layered timelines, cities overlapping, jurisdictions misaligned. Governments will lose continuity. Nuclear command nets might not, legally, have a single coherent history to respond from. Supply chains, power grids, financial ledgers, shattered, not metaphorically, practically. Civilization-grade failure. Ethan's training offered up counter-arguments, protocols for cascade control, redundancies, cross-anchoring. He watched the hollow as it displayed the cascade curve, exponential, unforgiving. The end-state simulation was jagged, maps shattering like glass. "Who scheduled the reboot?" Ethan asked, throat dry. Variant Ethan met his eyes, his own eyes. A failsafe set by the vault's governance under the guise of compliance, a board-level decision. They were nervous about a leak, about liabilities, about audits. They'd rather wipe traces than fix broken entanglements. Someone thought a clean slate would solve the problem. And you couldn't go through channels. Ethan finished for him. Variant Ethan nodded. Channels are slow. Approvals are politics. At 7 a.m., the purge fires. I can't stop the purge remotely, but I can hold the loop long enough to patch the stabilizer manually, force a microstate correction, splice a filter into the reboot sequence, and prevent the resonance. That requires the loop to be stable for at least 5 hours. It also means I must be the one to keep it running while I code the patch, and I can't risk the agency shooting me while I work. Ethan's mind jogged. If the loop were kept, millions would wake to the same hour, possibly without memory. If the loop were broken before the patch, the purge would cascade. If the patch succeeded, the purge could be modified to scrub malicious traces without amplifying. The moral geometry was vicious. "You want me to help you," Ethan said flatly. "I want you to understand. I want you to remember after the loop collapses. That's why I put the chips in your locker and harness. The memory dump is encoded on the chip. It's a timeline seed. Insert it post-return, and you will carry the patch's blueprint in your head. Only then will you be able to authenticate the fix and stand with me in court, with the agency, to argue for the route we took." He took a breath, voice slightly ragged. "If you help me, you don't just save the city. You become responsible for the knowledge of why we did it. If you don't, I do this alone. If I die, the evidence dies with me. They purge, and history forgets the reason it nearly collapsed. Who wins then? No one. That's why I need you." Ethan looked at the device in Variant Ethan's hands.
the stabilizer override. Even at a distance, it looked like a small black moon. It would not be simple to disarm without a technical window. There was a cocking of muscles, a flinch in his own jaw that told him his decision would define the rest of his life. "Okay," he said finally. It took him a second to realize he'd said it out loud. His voice shook. "What's the plan?" Variant Ethan's relief was quiet. He slid the device into a safety cradle and began dictating roles with the brisk, exacting manner of a man who had rehearsed every step a dozen times to outrun catastrophe. "You stay with the harness. You're my anchor in the loop. Your badge signature will propagate through the instantiation network and give me a stable reference frame to code against. I'll go into the vault's server chamber and splice the filter. You'll be the liaison if the agency interferes. If Helena or Ops show up and try to terminate me, you'll have to argue for a continuance while I finish the patch." Ethan opened his mouth to protest. Protocol 0. But Variant Ethan held up a hand. "I know the writ. I know the guidelines. But sometimes law is behind events. You can't prosecute a dead timeline. You can, however, ensure the living continue with the timeline intact." They worked against the clock. Variant Ethan moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed every step a dozen times, and Ethan found himself following instructions, attaching a stabilizer clamp here, initiating a soft echo loop there. The rooftop became a clinical theater where pragmatism overrode ideology. At 6:32 a.m., the ops channel lit up. "Helena Dewes, crisp, authoritative. Agent Carter, report." Ethan's throat closed. He hadn't expected them to wait so long. Variant Ethan's fingers caused on a wire. "Director Price, we've found the trigger. We're patching." Helena's voice snapped with official caution. "You are a suspect, Agent. You're to stand down. We have reasons to believe Variant Carter is unstable. Surrender the device." Ethan felt the weight of her command like a hand on his chest. Variant Ethan's jaw tightened. He moved, quickly and with purpose, into the hatch and vanished from sight. Ethan stayed above, a conduit, his badge idling like a heartbeat across an ocean of repeating time. He watched the skyline, watching his older self disappear into the belly of the vault, and felt the thin, precise fear. He was an accomplice in a crime that might save everything or doom them all. At 6:47 a.m., the first ping came through the remote feed. Device temperature nominal. Network handshake established. Variant Ethan's face on the monitor, lit by server LEDs, looked younger beneath that effort. He was coding in a language that even
Ethan could feel as if it bent physical law, micro-entanglement filters, entropic dampeners, resonant sinks. His fingers moved with the fury of someone who had miscounted nights and chose to fix it with fury. At 6:58 a.m., a new feed activated. Ops watchers, legal observers, the director's face pale but steady. Helena watched, eyes fixated on the stream. Ethan kept his hands steady on the harness, feeling the faint tug of repeated morning emness wrap around him like a slow current. At 6:59 a.m., Variant Ethan hovered his hand over the last terminal. The purge timer ticked. 0001. On the rooftop, the city held its breath. At 7 a.m., the purge sequence initiated. Lights winked in a heartbeat. The vault's central frame began its authorized spin. And then, Variant Ethan screamed, a sound broken in two parts. First, the exertion of final keystrokes, then the force of something hitting him from within. The screen stuttered. A warning alarm screamed from Ops. Helena's face snarled, caught between command and horror. Ethan could hear nothing in the rooftop cold but the drum in his ears. Variant Ethan's image on the feed distorted into fractal tiles. He did not speak, he typed. He stabbed a final line of code into the console. The filter began to upload upward like a slow bloom. Something struck the server room, a pulse that rattled through the building, then through the feed, and the monitors began to bloom with static. On the rooftop, Ethan felt the harness surge, the chip in his seam warm as a living thing. Memory, images, threw themselves at him in a flash. Calculations and formulas, faces and memos,
a boardroom where men had feared audit, a janitor who had hidden evidence, a child in the market who had watched a man hand around a coin. Snatches of a past Variant Ethan had tried to compress into a single mind. When the static finally cleared, the feed showed Variant Ethan slumped in the server room, breathing but ragged, a smear of blood across his temple where a fallen rack had nicked him. The filter was installed. The purge had been rerouted into a safer path. Helena's face, visible on Ethan's rooftop feed, went still. On the rooftop, Ethan exhaled a sound that felt like a surrender and a prayer. He had chosen a path outside policy, and for one brief, bright moment, the world did not fracture. But the hour was not done. The loop's persistence remained, for Variant Ethan had kept it running to buy time. Choices remained. To break the loop now and let the world continue with the memory of what had nearly happened, or to let the loop persist while the consequences and legalities were hashed out in public view. Ethan reached for the chip in his harness, feeling the encoded weight of responsibility. He knew what he held in his hand, not merely data, but the truth of a day that had almost gone wrong, and the moral account that would follow. He looked down at the server room feed where Variant Ethan lay bundled in cables, and thought absurdly of his own face reflected in a coin. He had his next 5 minutes to decide how history would remember a man who bent a morning to save a nation, and whether law would consider him protector, criminal, or both.